Welcome to the Lost Signals discusses philosophy, narrative, and the mechanics of criticism. In this show, we analyze the greatest minds of narratology, both classic and current. Enjoy. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Lost Signals discusses philosophy and narrative, or whatever the title of this show is.
I believe it's that for now.
Hey, whatever. So, on a previous episode, we did The Death of the Author by Roland Barthes. And I wanted to build off of the concepts he addressed in there. In particular, that what happens when a figure in popular culture leaves the domain of the original creator and moves to, in a sense, becomes mythologized in a society.
Into the pop culture sphere in general, right?
Yeah. And then ownership moves from, in a sense, the author to, one could argue, the fandom. One could argue the culture that created it. And we're going to discuss that going forward. But I'm going to start off this conversation with, and this is indifferent than many of our other episodes on this. This is not, we're not basing this off of a work. This is kind of all original research we did. And so this is not an original concept in the sense that throughout history, we have been elevating characters to, in this sense, mythological proportions. So, and the idea also that these characters can shift to meet that moment in time. So there's a very famous example that I remember from taking a Greek mythology class with Hercules, who has existed throughout for millennia now.
Well established.
Yeah, but it has adapted to comic books nowadays, to arguably The Witcher nowadays. We made that, I think, to Kevin Sorbo, and but back in the day, even back in Greece, they had Jason the Argonauts, and from what I remember about that, in one of the stories there, and perhaps I should have done more work, I apologize, but in order to differentiate the cultured Athenians from quote the more barbaric things, they had Hercules playing the foil to Jason, in a sense where Jason was, in a sense, the cultured Athenian, and Hercules being bravado, and he ends up running off to I think to chase after like a boulder or a log or something like that.
If I may make a joke, it's instead of exit pursued by a bear, he's exit pursuing a bear.
Yeah,
like
in a sense, yeah. But the idea of he was not an unintelligent brute, but that's adapting a hero of certain cultures and using it to tell a tale of your own society. But that's kind of the beginning point. But there are many other, and we're going to talk more about the modern popular culture going forward. But do any of you have any initial comments to make?
No, I mean, so the general idea is, again, I don't want to steal like things that you're probably going to say or characters you're going to point to, but maybe one might be helpful, like something like Batman, that was a more modern one, right? A modern mythologized character that has now gone well beyond the original creator. This is his own separate, so you can argue and make research about who created and owns, like originally at least, that character, but it doesn't matter at this point because it exists, as you said, like almost peripherally, tangentially in the greater pop culture mindset, and that character and all the trappings thereof and all other things that are attached to it can be used by various creators and have been, right, to tell a story that, yes, still crystallizes the core concepts and the idea, like the aspects and traits of that character, what have you, this fictional semi-mythological hero, at least a person, that then, like, it doesn't matter who's using that character for a story. Like, and we can argue about the quality and like the like which ones are better or not. But the greater point, to your point, is that they've transcended so much that almost anyone can use them in any work, any medium, and drop them in to tell a story, and it will be recognizable they will pretty easily, instantly, if you will, by general audiences, and therefore you have like, I don't want to say a shortcut, I guess, but just an easy in to then drop into the story and tell a modern sort of mytho-cultural tale. So, what do you guys think?
I'm kind of addressing more of a franchise, but what came to mind is Lord of the Rings, that whole Middle Earth thing, because when the Jackson films come out, he did take some liberties, and there's two characters I thought of in particular. One's Galadriel, because everybody's like, I know people who are like, Kate Blanchett wasn't this astounding, translating Galadriel has to do with what your perception of beauty is.
I think a lot of
like
that
whether or not I think Kate Blanchett's gorgeous, but that might not be anybody's picture of it. I know that. And then Liv Tyler's character, who I'm blocking, who is literally in the books a background character whose character got elevated. So it's because of a theatrical narrative and whatever hubris that I say this after the Hobbit films that I only saw one of, the hubris of Peter Jackson, and some of the liberties
Honey, dear boy,
that he took with things like in the Two Towers. But it's just like everybody had such an ownership of that franchise that those two characters were, it wasn't, God, I'm blocking her name. Liv Tyler's character didn't, cause the river to rise and knock out the Nazgul. That was Elrond. And, there was like all these little fired up things. But, like I said, that's a franchise, but there's two characters in there that I know personally from people who are really into Tolkien who took exception on one or both of those characters.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, I everybody's kind of said a bunch of things now. I think that it is interesting to look at these, like the Greek Roman gods or some of the earliest versions of this to happen, like, to be used. And now you've got them showing up in comics and other kinds of shows, TV, movie, what have you, pretty much everywhere that they can. And you're starting to see that more with some things. But I wanted to talk about like where the kind of line is of what counts as characters that are truly like, open to use or like have ascended beyond their creators, because I would say like Lord of the Rings would not fit that of like it's ascended beyond its creator. I don't think that Tolkien is, I don't think they are separate from Tolkien in the way that James Bond is separate from
Fleming.
Christ. Yeah. So, and in the same kind of way, I would say that like other ones that kind of fall into that are like, the Song of Ice and Fire / Game of Thrones had its own TV show that certainly didn't follow exactly what happened in the books, but I think that's still a George R.R. Martin thing. And like, Harry Potter is still a J.K. Rowling thing, stuff like that. And then you have stuff like, comic book characters who, you might remember who created Spider-Man or Batman or whatever, or whatever one of these characters, but they're not theirs anymore. If they ever even were. I mean, I guess for a little while they were, but like these are characters that are the world that they live in and the characteristics they inhabit are the more important thing, not the creator, you know.
I always think
So
I
that's
thought of
kind of
one.
that's kind of where my head went when we were going to talk about this. So that's my intro.
Robin Hood.
That's a really good one.
Yeah.
But before we hop into examples of things, I actually want to address what Steven said because that's a very good point. When so I think this is very Bartian and also other philosophers we've dealt with in narrative is the idea of the archetype. Sure. And that it's interesting to me which of these characters fit in with cultural archetypes and, in a sense, the history of storytelling. That so a lot of them are whether you want to do Norse mythology, Greek mythology, were used there. But are these archetypes a natural element of narrative, or do characters, for some reason, click with that the zeitgeist of the moment, and then perhaps they can create new archetypes? For instance, can we look at Sherlock or James Bond and trace their history of their characters through generations, or are they crafting something new? And that's a fascinating discussion to have. One I'm unprepared to do, but that was a great question, Steve.
Well,
No, I think sorry. If I can jump in, yeah, I think you're right. It is a good point because, yeah, I guess the question is like, where do we draw the line? Like, is there a delineation of like these ones for sure are right, or these ones like, or more, if you will, Steve, like to paraphrase you, anchored to their creators more so in a way that others may not be, even if they're all generally within the purview of like open free use, like known widely and broadly by audiences and fans, etc., but still like intrinsically anchored to the creators that their originators, versus ones that like I think Sherlock is a good one too. Like I know you said we'll wait to examples, but just to sort of draw a vague line, like a blurry line, I guess, right? Yeah, man, like you're right. I mean, who's to decide? Who's to say these ones are this set A here is anchored, like again, more attached to the original creator's, vision, intention, etc., what have you, like a la death of the author in a way, and then which ones have transcended enough to enough of a degree that they are now like much more removed from the author again, originator of them.
yeah. You know, I think that there's certainly some subjectivity to the question, but there's like I don't think I would get much argument that Lord of the Rings is a Tolkien thing, not a Peter Jackson thing, or like even more so like I said, Harry Potter or Game of Thrones.
Actually, I want to talk about Lord of the Rings for a second because it's an interesting case study in that one, its influence in the fantasy genre is undeniable. So in a sense, it spawned a lot of children that became the codifiers for a lot of these archetypes. But also, Gandalf, for instance, you can trace back to Odin and other wizard types throughout history. However, what distinctly makes them a Tolkien thing versus, and there have been many versions. It's not just Jackson and Tolkien.
Yeah.
There's the old animated stuff. There's video games. I want to argue that Harry Potter, since you brought that up, perhaps in time would become would be removed from J.K. Rowling and become its own thing if they continue to produce new works with it.
I'd like to propose something real quick, sort of on the spot that I thought of as we were talking it out. Maybe again, like it might go back to the death of the author idea. Like, does the original creator have to die for it to like what happens if and when? Well, I guess not if, when J.K. Rowling and Martin die, right? Do their works like at that point or some nebulous time thereafter? Then is it like that they transcend more into the sphere beyond it because the original creators no longer are alive here to say and have any direction upon them. Like maybe that's why like the Greek myths, the Norse myths, as you said, like Thor and Odin and so forth. Like yes, they're archetypes, and cultures have produced. This is a thing we discussed in other episodes, right? They produce separately similar archetypes of these mytho-historical figures, right? And maybe that's just intrinsic to humanity, but then the details and such and so forth, like because at least at this point, those are ancient things, like things of the past. Whereas some of the properties we're discussing are still like existing, and the originators of them are alive to this day, and thus do have an influence and say and sway over them, of course, because they're their properties. But what happens when that stuff becomes like, I don't know, like open source, if you will, like open trademark, copyrights and whatever, like expire because the author has expired of them. I think that's an interesting point, interesting question, interesting thing to explore. So you guys,
Or you sell your you sell your characters and world to Disney for $4 billion.
Yes, exactly, Chris. Like,
So, what was it? Comedy is tragedy
Plus
for
time.
time. Yeah. This is reproduction plus time. The moral work is reintroduced into society
maybe
because that there you're having evolution of a character. Because someone, it's not just the repetition of the story, but it's authors adding their own voices on it, thus stripping the story of perhaps the ancillary and stripping it down to what makes Superman Superman, and then adding the modern cultural touch to the voice of that author, but it's stripped of all ancillary to make that core that can then be used.
So could slash fiction fall into this purview? Because Sherlock and Watson apparently were the first slash fiction, or among the first slash fiction. Like female
They were
fandom.
my first slash fiction.
well, like it's tangentially related, Chris. Don't be wrong, but I think Steve, you're gonna say something.
Yeah, well, I was gonna address, because you brought this up again, Ian, as the like, as the evolution through time of these characters, and as they're being written by other authors, like what kind of remains the same. But I'm also like equally fascinated by what changes. Like if you look at a character like Batman through the years, who used to like shoot people with guns when he was first drawn, and now he's got this like no killing, no guns
only got one rule
that's like steadfast. This is Batman, this is who he is.
And sometimes it's difficult to get rid of a bomb for but like that actually Batman's, because I think Superman's a more interesting one to discuss over that the core ethics of what makes Superman Superman. And that's why some people were like, the Zack Snyder version of him violated what Superman meant to them, because it was a violation of that core concept. What is the core concept of Batman? That is a fascinating it's a tragedy. The fact that someone that his parents have to die.
Yeah, I mean,
That's
I would
the
say
only.
It's similar to Spider-Man, but I would say that one of the core concepts of Batman now, which like wasn't originally one, is what I just said. Like that he has this moral like code not to kill anyone and never to use guns, and like that wasn't at all a part of the character when it was created. I think it's interesting to see that not only can these characters become this like larger mythologized character, but they don't necessarily have to be what they started as, and they don't even the core central parts of them can evolve over time. And I think that's really cool. And like they become these characters that their creators never actually intended, right? And I'm sure that's the case with like the god myths of ancient times, ancient religions, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, it actually, like, that's perfect because it ties back to what Ian started out with in the intro. Like, even the Hercules thing, right? That was the case even by the time of Jason and the Argonauts, which is by this point, of course, ancient history. But the core, as you said, Sivo, the core traits of the character were maybe quite the same, like certainly different than the original like parts of it, and but used in a work of from antiquity that still was changed. So sorry, good.
But to your point, valid point there. I just thought of something. Did perhaps Batman, and by no means am I a Batman scholar, uh, did he shift archetypes over time? Because I heard a comment recently like it's nice to see Batman finally doing some detective work. I forget what it was the reference to, but was he the noirish Sherlock-esque archetype that shifted to the moral avenger archetype? Thus, we have different expectations for him now than we did, but it's still, and that's why he's persisted over time.
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
So-
it's all down to like who was writing him, really.
Yeah, but now there are, as you said, there's definite ideas of what Batman is in the current generation.
Yeah, but if somebody like Frank Miller comes along and completely changes his like who he is, then that has a chance to stick and like become his new kind of archetype.
Yeah, I guess you said like perhaps like maybe it's like somewhat. I know we discussed this concept of the great man of history, so not quite to that extent, but like certain writers who are allowed or able, etc., in whatever way they work with a character that is not necessarily usually the case that not their creation, but they're given the chance to work with this IP, etc., right? And they do such like a resonant story or a version of that character that then the characteristics or the slight changes and tweaks or whatever, what have you, that they make to it are so resonant to the audiences and do so well that maybe that then like that does become a new part of a mythology and the new characteristics, or at least a later version of that.
But you can also argue for on that variance. I agree with you that if a profound work forever changes it can the individual, but perhaps there is a need at the moment in civilization to have to reflect that moment. So all of a sudden, a this happens all the time in comics and in other works where a character all of a sudden reemerges, meeting the moment.
Yeah, no, you're right.
And it's not necessarily the author itself that is pushing this, but it is the a void being filled. No, a void being filled. But Chris, you haven't spoken in a while.
Yeah, I have two minor things. Well, one minor and one controversial. J. Michael Straczynski, when he was writing a Batman, or sorry, Spider-Man, when 9/11 happened, they wanted to do the 9/11 issues, and it took him a while. It didn't. He was on location for Jeremiah. I think that was his show. He was shooting up in Canada. And it hit him how Spider-Man would have reacted to that. So to your point, Ian, it's just like what's going on. What does the world need from that character at that time? The other thing is when you're talking about Superman, and this all depends on whether you believe in him or believe he's the son of God or if he is God. But if you look at Jesus, and then you look at the Last Temptation of Christ. I mean, you want to talk about cancel culture from the right. These motherfuckers went over and spent like a year trying to cancel this. Funny thing is, they had a park to protest it at Universal lot, so they actually had to pay for parking to protest the film at Universal. but the thing is, it's the same thing with the Snyder cut where Superman kills General Zod. Here we have the Last Temptation of Christ, where Christ actually doubts his thing, where he actually for a moment takes the other path, where he doesn't be the martyr, where he grows old and lives with Mary Magdalene and has to deal with the people saying like, we did this for you and you basically let us down, so there was that whole thing within the work. So that's the only thing that, whether this historical figure, how this historical figure fits into whether he was a man, whether he was the son of God, whether he was God, I don't know. I believe the man. I don't believe, that he was the son of God or whatever.
Nice guy, sure.
But the thing is, there was an ideal that he had to live to, and I know a lot of people who are religious who went to see that movie, and they thought it was cool to know that Jesus was human. But then you've got another sect that said, no way, Jesus was always above all of this. And then if you read Christopher Moore's wonderful book, Lamb, there's a whole missing 18 years that actually makes a lot of sense, that if Christ were to come back, and I know I'm diverting just a little bit, but but the point is, you've got some takes on it that kind of flesh out his character, that flesh him out a little more, give him alternate paths that would kind of lead him to where he ultimately ended up within the historical context. So I know that was a little bit of a divergence, but
Chris, I don't think it's a diversion at all, because we started this off with talking about mythology and also the adaptation for what is needed during the time for mythological figures. So the fact is that Jesus of Nazareth can be adapted to meet the culture of the time is a perfect example. But
Yeah, no, I mean, sorry, I don't want to cut you off, but I just want to add, because this is an amazing segue, because I think maybe you talked around it, maybe I'll paraphrase. Like, I feel as if it's obvious, and I guess guys, tell me if you disagree, that any culture whatsoever throughout history, past, present, future, is going, of course, to, for lack of a better term, co-opt mytho-historical figures for the needs to fit the society and like what's happening within a given culture at any given time, right? So like, it's naturally going to be an offshoot of that, and that's going to inform the vision and the intention and the use of any character. Yeah, you're right, Chris. Going back to the story of Jesus and everything like that, like that's no exception. It's follows the same rule, I would say. So
actually, there's there was a philosopher I like quite a bit who wrote the basically he rewrote the Bible with stripping all of the supernatural elements out of it. Those are the moral teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. But the thing is, like, he found use for the morality of Christianity, which is a fairly, like, if you actually look at what's said in there, is very
solid enough.
And he's like, it is a good framework, but the idea is that the mythology of it didn't service his needs, or but nonetheless. Anyone else want to I know you have a bunch about James Bond. If you want to shift from Jesus Christ to James Bond,
perfect shift.
Bond is Jesus, obviously. You know what? Like, I did a lot of research, and like, yeah, sure, but actually didn't want to mention, like, maybe I'll hold off on this. So I'll introduce the topic, and you tell me if you want to like wait for later. But kind of relate to what I just said. The opposite end of the coin is, I guess, the capitalist cynicism of it all, especially in terms of IPs. Like, nobody owns the rights to Jesus, like, that's in the sense that I'm speaking of, right? Someone does own the rights to James Bond. Someone does own the rights to Sherlock Holmes. Like, sure, they pass through corporation to corporation, but because that is the case, because we live in this system, society, and so forth, that means there is some like dirty uses of it, or like they can get real nasty about it in that sense. And I guess I'll just, as a broad overview, to tie it into Bond too, certain interpretations of the character were disliked by the estate of Ian Fleming well after he passed. Like, they were like, no, we're not approving this novel, what have you, whatever. Like, we don't like the way doing it. It's not the Bond that our Ian, like, our ancestor, grandfather, great father, etc. like vision. So we're not approving it, and that can, in fact, I think, inform like the pop culture use of it because of the very nature of that, which again is somewhat cynical, but nevertheless, that's what we live with. So I just want to introduce that idea as well.
By the way, I think you'll appreciate this a lot, Chris. You know, pitch meeting.
Yeah, I love pitch meeting.
You ever see the one for Casino Royale?
I don't.
Probably.
I don't think so.
They're trying to talk about who they're going to recast Bond as, and they go Daniel Craig.
Yes, I did.
Hey, he's a little too blonde for Bond, so they give you this one. They keep saying, because they keep referencing blonde actors. Well, yeah, Idris Elba. No, he's too blonde, but he's not. No, he's too blonde.
Yeah, it's like, again, cynically, corporations, like, again, whoever holds the rights to whatever character, like, who owns the rights to Hercules right now?
Yeah.
You know, it's a different thing than the more modern stuff like Marvel and so forth. So again, I'm sorry if that derailed it a bit, but I just want to throw that idea concept because we are here in endgame capitalism, if you will, and it's gonna. I think I'm sorry, Chris. My conjecture is that it's gonna matter to a degree who does own the rights. So like, you know, if one can own a rights to a fucking fictional character, which you can in this society, which then might inform like whoever is like saying like you can't do it this way or do it this way because we want to push an agenda of some sorts or another. So
yeah,
go ahead.
Well, Marvel is a great example because look at the Fantastic Four. Corman made that movie that was not supposed to be released, which apparently was better than the two that Tim Story did.
Sure it was.
But they filmed but the whole thing with Sony and the whole thing with whoever owned whatever is a matter of making shit just to keep the rates, even if you don't have any idea what to do with it.
Exactly.
Yep. Yeah, I mean that was and that is a big issue. I won't necessarily say a problem because I think if you create IP, you should own it. I especially have I have more sympathy for like creators, like human creators, than like the fucking companies that own giant swaths of things. But like at the same time, you know, like I get why there are copyright laws and they're important to protecting people. So I'm not like mad about it, but it is an issue that you have to face if you're trying to use characters that are in the public eye that aren't like, you know, the Greek gods or whatever, or Jesus. Been out of copyright for a while now, but like, yeah, it is like, obviously Marvel, like companies like Marvel just have and DC just have like hand their characters off to creators and they're like, all right, you deal with this guy for a little while and then we'll get somebody else. So that's how they kind of create this sense of turnover and like the sense of community owning of characters or whatever. But for people that, you know, kind of don't really do that, like Sherlock Holmes has run into the same thing that you're mentioning with Bond, where the estate doesn't want it portrayed in a certain way.
And Enola Holmes was actually one of my favorite portrayals of Sherlock that they had.
Yeah.
And the estate didn't particularly care for it. I think they were looking for money. I think it was a cynical ploy, but it wasn't about the integrity of the character. But again, that's a fan's perspective and not a.
Yeah. Who would have thought like Henry Cavill was probably the best Sherlock?
One of the great versions of Holmes. I agree. I guess. All right. So like this, not my last thought, but maybe to this specific thing where because of copyright laws, because of we have these things set up, right, Steve-O, there are certain entities like that aren't like Dracula. I think is the one that comes to mind. Like nobody, I don't think necessarily owns Dracula because it's been 100 years or more since like the rights have expired essentially. So it's open source. Or there's a term that I'm forgetting here, but
in fact, if you made an authentic Dracula in this modern day, no one would recognize it because it has nothing to do with the original creation.
What it's become, right? And there are others like that. I'm saying it's like so. Like I think even like some maybe like love like Cthulhu shit. Like I believe like
Frankenstein's monster.
Yeah, exactly. Right. There are certain, and those are I would assume and guess like conjecture bet that they were well known within the still exist, float around the
public domain.
Yeah, public domain. Thank you. That's what it is, right? So like artificially, right? In 102 centuries, perhaps the rights to the fucking X-Men or whatever, what have you, insert like relevant Marvel comic shit, something like that. Here might then expire, and therefore, like, no one owns them in the sense that the IP can be owned. To your point, Steve, all right, which then might drive. And one more thing to you, or to everyone, but the last thing to you, Steve, is that what if a creator like does a run on insert character here, whatever, that isn't like that? I was like, people are like, I don't, not good, or like they do an offensive like thing with it or something, right? Like that can be the case.
Well,
It's happened.
I don't mean to bring this all about comic books here, but I think because it's such a prominent aspect of our society nowadays. Yeah. If you look at like shows like The Boys, where they have, or Powers, where they have a Superman figure who matches all of the core aspects of them, but not by name, and you recognize who that character is supposed to represent, but almost an inversion of that. You have, but what I'm more fascinated by is the reaction from fan base, which theoretically is the arbiter of these characters going forward. You have people who you ask what Man of Steel was a, I already mentioned that, but like a negative response. I'm fascinated though by Harley Quinn and by WandaVision, which is premiering now, in that both of them are, in a sense, unique attempts to work within established frameworks that are beloved by the fan base because they're taking huge risks in necessarily changing both the message and, but I think because they're showing respect to the core archetype, but building a story around it that's their own telling. And I think that's how the effective use of manipulation of these archetypes work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would suggest Doom Patrol is in that same vein as well.
Yeah, that's a good one, buddy.
But yeah, I agree. I think it's interesting, and it's hard to get away from comics when you have this discussion or when you talk about this stuff, because
as of this time, like you may, again, perhaps in future.
I guess we're gonna talk about John Wayne archetypes in cowboy movies. But.
Yeah,
I was gonna say Dracula reminded me of F.W. Murnau when he did Nosferatu. He tried to get the rights from Bram Stoker's widow, and she's like, So he changed the names. Essentially, the story is the exact same. All he did was change the names and kind of.
That's how you get around copyright laws.
Yeah, he slid through it just by like changing the names and some minor details. I said nowadays, the lawyer, whoever was representing the widow would have been like, "Are you fucking kidding me? We're suing the shit out of you. There's no fucking way that you're getting away with this nonsense." But,
right, but you're right. Like in that
100 years ago,
that's a great. I mean, saying like to me, like my dark fascination here was like the cynicism of that all. Or like, like stop it, you can't do that. We're suing the crap out of you. We, it's too similar, like etc.
So are you saying that capitalism smothers the mythologizing of our society?
Yes, capitalism smothers creativity. That is absolutely what I'm saying.
No, not creativity, specifically
yes,
elevation of works
yes,
to a higher plane.
Yeah, I feel like that's creativity in a way. So like in a broad general definition, yes, I am saying that. Indeed. I will stand by that. At least again, as of 2021, where we stand here. Yes.
Or some might argue that capitalism smothers the stealing of other people's work to do with it what you want.
Yeah, but by death of the author, the minute you put a work out there, it's no longer yours.
Well, that's if you accept that definition, sure.
Well, I think you're arguing from a very capitalist mindset. But
I mean, why wouldn't you if you wanted to defend the way that the system works, or the way that the copyright system works anyway?
It's a scale, I think, right? Like that's what I'm saying. Like I don't know. That's at least how I somewhat view it. And sure, you can be. It can be cynical, and You can point to many examples that we just have about it, but I still think it is the general topic of this entire episode, as introduced earlier. I think does stand and at least is always going to be relevant. I guess as long as I conjecture human civilization creating works of art and again mytho historical ish characters like this and figures and so forth. So
I'm going to get meta for a second. If narrative is inherently the subconscious of civilization, it's where we work out our ethics. It's where we work out our causality. It's where we work out our hopes and dreams and whatnot. Then it will forever. These archetypes represent the best and worst of us, and how to deal and how we should act, which we should aspire to act like. And you see that nowadays with people. I'm a Spider-Man. I'm a Batman. I'm a Superman. These are my favorite heroes because these are the people I aspire to, and whether that's good or bad is I think that has always been you craft that narrative to work that out. So
no, I agree. Like, it's sort of what I was getting at, and
Mhm.
well said, well restated. So, I'm just saying, like, it to me, it's intrinsically the case, and yeah, sure, you can get into the nitty gritty uh of what we just talked about, like, who owns what, like, and then if the author dies, even if they're not dead per se, like, their creation transcends in many ways. So, I don't know. What do you guys think about that?
About if the author, when the author dies. I mean, that is the case. I don't know. I think it can go both ways. Like, it's like Tolkien's not alive anymore, but as we were mentioning earlier, you probably see a lot of his work as still Tolkien.
Certain
stuff.
ones are still like,
As opposed to Fleming, who, like, Bond has transcended past like being Ian Fleming's, you know, obviously he's still the creator, but I don't think it's I don't think he's a Fleming
the character itself has well beyond.
attached thing anymore.
but I'd also argue that perhaps Hannibal is achieving that movement of elevation above, and Thomas Harris is still alive, and I think that he's not dead, but he's almost doesn't care about.
Sort of in hibernation about his character.
Well, he's accepted. Because I think that when we're talking about the death of the author, it's not necessarily the physical death;
Right.
it's the death of the author's connection with that character. And I think he has pulled the plug in a sense of that connection, and has allowed it to that multiple people can go in and give their interpretation. And again, very much like we were talking about this over with James Bond. If James Bond is the Gilgamesh type, that is about civilization, the warrior of the civilization. Hannibal is in that almost inverse of the decadence of civilization. Yeah, so
I was going to say, thinking about James Bond, because everybody's like, well, who's your favorite Bond? I know a lot of people didn't like Timothy Dalton, where my ex-girlfriend's brother-in-law said that Timothy Dalton, who he was a big fan of the books, he said Timothy Dalton was probably the closest to the way
Fleming intended.
Fleming had intended him. And he also made me think about like Doctor Who, because the same thing, I mean, it's I'm being very loose here, but who's your favorite doctor and what does the doctor represent? And now within universe, I think they're trying to retcon James Bond, where it's just like this position in MI6,
yep.
Is always going to be a 007. Is always going to have an alias as James Bond, so they can kind of create the universe where all the actors can actually fit into it, which is something that Doctor Who did, I think, from inception. That generation. So I'm just saying that, like, there has been, at least in the Bond to what I remember, I believe that that's what they're trying to do with Bond now, especially since they were talking Idris Elba and, oh my God, maybe making 007 a woman, God forbid,
Oh my mind.
or have the doctor be a woman, God forbid, or Scottish. There was a whole thing with like Scottish actors playing, Doctor Who.
I would accept a female Doctor Who, a Scottish Doctor Who. No, thank you.
Come on,
but isn't Sean Connery Scottish, and he had to don an English accent too? So
your own chat.
Sean Connery is my least favorite Bond.
I like Sean Connery as Bond.
It's nothing to do with the sexism. It has everything to do with being Scottish.
Is national.
I like their whiskey, don't like their actors. Right? Sure. Is that what you're saying?
Sure.
Well, like, you're right. That is like, it's a funny, I still think certainly relevant point, like to that degree. Like, yeah. And again, I feel like, I guess I've introduced this idea, like somewhat cribbing from Ian's studies in a sense. Like, I feel like there could be a grouping, or at least a set, like A, B, C, etc., of pop culture properties / entities, for lack of a better term to call them, like they can fall into, like, you got, right, Steve-O, you got your tokenist thing where, like, it's very more closely related still, even to this day, even if there was a literal and or metaphorical death of the author attached to their creation, where others can be more removed and more removed and more removed, etc., until you become to your Marvel characters and what have you.
I just want to throw this out there to the audience. Everyone's listening, and like, we're open to becoming a think tank for narrative theory. So we'll actually come up with these categorizations if you pay us.
Sure.
For money. We'll become, exactly. God damn you, Steve. We'll become the new historical creators for money. But yeah, I mean, I do think it's a very interesting idea, and like, there's no like real hard and fast answers, but I think it's an important thing to consider, because it does, many of them can reflect the culture and societal's values at the times, even if they're using, like, again, a figure and a creation from generations ago, centuries ago even, or creating new ones on the spot to fulfill that role.
Yeah. Well,
anyone have any other thoughts?
No, my brain is empty.
Well, I could have told you that, but
no more thoughts left to think.
Chris, got anything?
No.
Okay, cool. I think this is a nice close of the conversation.
Yep.
I did kind of awkwardly, but say love you. Anyway, I don't introduce us initially, but I'm Jonathan Ian Manser. You're with Christopher Morgan.
Have a good night, everyone.
Stephen Ramosi.
Hold on to those characters.
And Scott Thurlow.
I'm both shaken and stirred by this conversation.
And by the way, George Lazenby. We all agree on that.
We can agree that is it. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us. Hope you learned something on philosophy and narrative. We'll see you next time. Cheers.
Thank you for listening to The Lost Signals discusses philosophy, narrative, and the mechanics of criticism. Editing and engineering by Jonathan Ian Manser. Music by Christopher Morgan. Check us out on YouTube and iTunes for the shows, and on Facebook and Twitter for updates.